Our scripture to this morning is a selection from Paul's letter to the church at Corinth, 1 Corinthians 9:16 through 23. If I proclaim the gospel, this gives me no ground for boasting, for an obligation is laid on me, and woe to me if I do not proclaim the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am entrusted with a commission. What then is my reward? Just this, that in my proclamation I may make the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my rights in the gospel. For though I am free with respect to all, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, so that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that I might by all means save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, so that I may share in its blessings.
Well, greetings, dear friends. It's a privilege and honor to finally make it to Mound Ridge, Kansas in this earthly journey of mine. I've heard of this place for quite a while, and now I'm actually here, at least on the outskirts. And I'm here, as Pastor Diane mentioned, as a representative, one of the board members of Mennonite Mission Network, the mission agency of our denomination, Mennonite Church USA. And on behalf of MMN, we appreciate the ways in which across the years, from the days before of COM and CHM into the present with Mission Network, the way this congregation has been supportive of the work of God, both close at hand and around the world. I'd like to use the passage that was read earlier from Paul's letter to the Corinthians as a sort of springboard to a few reflections on what it means to be in mission, or we often say missional today. That word, I think, still has some currency in our circles and beyond. This is something we are all about, being people of mission and service and love and compassion, whether it's right here across the street from where we live, or whether it's across a distant ocean. And one of the foundational aims of Mission Network is the hope that across the street and around the world, people of all cultures encounter Anabaptist expressions of the whole gospel of Jesus Christ. So that's for all of us right here where we are, just as much as it is for someone on an MVS assignment or an MCC assignment, someone who's volunteering with MDS or Mission Network, serving anywhere in our country or internationally. This showing interest in others, interested in walking in others' shoes, indeed loving others no matter, was part of Paul's, the one who wrote the passage to the Corinthians, part of Paul's very DNA. And it's what he encouraged in others. He believed in the action of love. And he felt that one of the ways we express this godly, other-focused love is by trying to find ways of walking in the next person's shoes. See the world through somebody else's eyes. Try to comprehend the worldview of others. Recognize that everyone matters to God, therefore, everyone matters to us. Well, our text in Corinthians takes us to the interesting folks of this town. Corinth was a port city, a cosmopolitan city. There was a lot of coming and going, travelers passing through, and people brought their goods and services, and people also brought their ideas of all sorts into this rather secular, cosmopolitan city. I gather that it had a kind of urban sophistication with all the stereotypes we might associate with that. Perhaps a bit of a laissez-faire attitude towards all manners of behavior, a touch of our modern, it's okay to just do your own thing spirit resonated in Corinth. And Paul, along with Aquila and Priscilla, a Jewish couple that had to exit Rome years ago, helped to establish this church in Corinth. And the church itself had its own diversity of viewpoints. And Paul, in Corinth, when he was in the Corinth context, was very concerned about the unity of the church. He deeply desired that we hang together in unity. He wanted his fellow Jesus followers, men and women alike, to hang together as opposed to flying apart. And in the preceding chapter, chapter 8, we read from chapter 9, one of the presenting issues in Corinth, Paul deals with, and that's the troubling matter of meat on the table, and what meat is okay to eat and what meat is not okay to eat. In that context, meat was something of a privilege to have, not a staple in everyone's everyday diet, but for those with a little more means, it was a kind of a pleasant luxury to enjoy meat with one's meal. But there was a problem because much of the meat had to pass through pagan temples on the way to the meat market. So it had been sort of blessed, if you will, in these troublesome settings before arriving in the market and then to your table. And so this meant that the meat was connected to idolatrous practices, and the Christian story was one of moving from practices of idolatry to faith and trust and belief in the one true God. Well, shouldn't Christians, therefore, avoid such contamination by eating such meat? For socially connected Christians in the city of Corinth, this was a little problem because, in my social settings, where I work, where I float around, having meat together with others is sort of natural and therefore okay. And after all, these idolatrous practices, those are just idols after all. Those aren't real. And we've moved beyond that. We see through it. It's fake. And so therefore, I can eat this meat. Paul himself seems to side with that kind of opinion. He doesn't have a particular problem. And he calls such people who were able to see beyond, he calls them the strong. We see through the fog. We're not in the grips of this pagan idol. It has no power, so pass the meat, please. But Paul is also very concerned about unity in the church. And he knows that there are also within the community folks for whom the meat is deeply troubling. He terms these folks the weak. And for them, eating meat is a form of idolatry. And so for the sake of unity in the church, he counsels the strong to bend, to bear with the views of the weak. So therefore restrained. No, thank you, my friend. I'll pass the meat on. It's not too hard for us to let the mind roam and think of modern examples. A lot of us, I'm presuming here, I don't know you well, but at least in my context, a lot of my people in my church enjoy a fine glass of wine with a meal, or a cold beer after some exercise. We see ourselves as strong. We know when to stop. Many of us, I presume here, as well as where I live, really like sports. It's Sunday. The NFL's on this afternoon. Go home and turn on the television set. Sort of live and die with one's team. But, of course, we are strong. I know when to turn off the TV, when it's time to prioritize my family and friends over this practice. We are strong. Perhaps some of you are very interested in politics or get involved and have some passions about, it's not too hard these days to be passionate and care about political stuff that's going on locally and in our country. And we may aggressively campaign for the people we prefer and believe in. And we feel we can do so without selling our souls. We are strong. But there are others, brothers and sisters of ours, who have known all too personally the seamy underbelly of alcohol, or who just plain think that a drink is an immoral thing to do. And there are some for whom too much sports begins to violate the Sabbath or becomes an idol demanding too much of our attention. And for some, the best path regarding politics is to just keep one's distance and stay quiet. Well, it's kind of difficult to shove Paul's thinking of strong and weak, and sometimes what is strong and what is weak in today's world is kind of hard to discern. But Paul's advice in his setting seems to be that the strong need to yield and give respect for the sake of unity to the weak. Now, I learned about this very, very personally many years ago in my obviously, I was younger. In the 70s, I lived in Chad, Africa. I was there with MCC. And at the time, the president of the country was after independence, the president was Francois Tombobai. And Mr. Tombobai decided that all in the spirit of African authenticity, that all men needed to return to their villages of origin and pass through their particular tribe's initiation rites. The Christian church was very small. And so Christians had to face, do I go back to the village as the president has ordered and pass through the initiation rite or not? Some Christians said, what's the big deal? Just go there and maybe learn to hunt and fish a little better, and there's a little blood, and no problem. Other Christians said, the things one has to do in my tribe's initiation rite violate my very faith and trust in the one true God. And so the church had this diversity of opinion around this issue. So who was the strong and who was the weak? So Paul figures, again, that the gospel springs from best is expressed when it comes from a place of unity. But this troubling church in Corinth had folks who said, I side with you, Paul. And others would say, I'm all for Apollos. And others said, I belong to Cephas. And the Corinthians tended to define themselves more by their differences than what they shared together. Paul is concerned about community, and he has strong convictions himself. Yet he says that I make the gospel free of charge. I read this, that Paul doesn't hold the gospel so tightly and so fiercely, that he does not and cannot allow some space for different understandings. He's bullheaded, Paul, but he seems to allow for some differences. The passage, I think, gets us close to the heart of Paul's missionary passion. I'm really concerned about unity. I want everybody to hear the gospel. And I care so much that I will bend over backwards in order to communicate with others. I will be a slave to all, so that even a few might be convinced of this Jesus. So what does he do, especially in approaching his fellow Jews? He says, to those who are in the clutches under the law, I too will become under the law. And for those who feel a little freer, and can live and work and function outside the law. I can be like them. I will be outside the law. And for those who are weak, well, I'll become like them. I'll become weak myself. I will do whatever it takes because everyone is important. Everyone is important to God. Everyone, therefore, is important to me. So I prefer to read Paul when he says things like, I'll be weak with the weak, outside the law with those outside the law, that it's important to be, cross-culturally sensitive, to use our kind of language, to be kind of multiculturally competent, to use our language. It's important to learn from the people we work among and live among. It's important to network and to partner with other people, to not just stay in our own circle, but to ingratiate in helpful, winsome ways ourselves with others. It's important to recognize that God has been doing something in other places long before we get there. So we can say that Paul is a real example to all of us modern folks, embodying a cross-culturally sensitive, missional, in the very best sense of the word, way of expressing the gospel. It's not too heavy-handed, it's flexible, it tries to be contextually relevant, it bends to the times. But saying all of that, isn't there something a little troubling? May we ask, is Paul, are we too chameleon-like? Who is Paul anyhow, if he can be like this over here and like that over there? I've wondered that about myself. I can stand here and sort of talk this way, but put me at a basketball game in the stands, at the dinner table with my extended family, on my side of the family, then put me at the similar table with my in-laws. Who am I anyway? Am I just skillful at being relevant in all these different places? Or do I have no center, no guiding core that keeps me authentically me as a follower of Jesus Christ in all of these places? Well, I think the way of peace, the way of authentic Christian mission, means being passionate and willing to walk deeply and caringly with others. It means, yes, walking in our neighbors' or our enemies' shoes for a while. Paul cared enough about the gospel, the full-orbed gospel of God's revolutionary, life-giving, reconciling, and others-centered love, that he dared to get up close and personal with the next person. The gospel doesn't just stay at a distance, pontificating from a soapbox to come to Jesus. It doesn't identify with the conquering, militant mentality that plants the country's flag and the gospel in the same place. It doesn't just shout peace slogans across the chasm to a beleaguered, conflicted politician. It makes a sturdy effort to dig in deep and understand. But again, this identifying and walking in another's shoes can be very tricky. The South African David Bosch, who was a missiologist from South Africa in the 20th century, he's since passed on, wrote about missionaries coming to his continent, gamely striving to walk in the shoes to the point where they deliberately renounced their own identity. One told him, "I try to forget that I'm an American." Well, Bosch said, "Who are you kidding? It's well known that you are an American." Paul himself, I think, did not try to in walking in another's shoes and identifying with others, did not at the same time try to submerge his own identity. Paul was intelligent. He was literate. He had education. He was Jewish. His particular coming to Jesus story, his conversion was dramatic. He was well-traveled. He'd been around. He had means. And I suppose that when Paul was at his best, he didn't suppress his identity in order to identify with the weak. And this applies to us as well. You know, this church here, you're folks from the prairies, in the Midwest. You're not in the big city. That's who you are. Some of us, whether we're educated or not as much, Christian, some of our identities, we're American, we're pacifist, whatever it is, we don't try to just sort of negate everything to become some kind of generic blob in order that we can talk to somebody. So obviously we're walking on a knife's edge. It's a balancing act. We are who we are, and it's important to embrace our own identities, where we're from and who we are in our own stories. At the same time, we communicate deep and passionate interest and care for the other person's story. At Mission Network, we preserve the lofty vision and hope that people of all cultures will be transformed by Jesus Christ to experience spiritual, social, and physical wholeness. And this happens as people see and experience authentic expressions of love. And this is experienced in our language through ministries characterized by compassion, peace, justice, and anti-racism. And I think people can detect our authenticity. You know, I know, others know, when someone is putting on airs, bluffing, sort of forcing it too much. People know honesty when they see it and sense it. People know and appreciate love when it is genuine. Yes, they will know we are Christians by our love. They will know that it is true, that everyone matters to God. They will know that it is true, that everyone matters to us too, when they see it and feel it and know it by our words and actions of love. Amen.